second talk we gave was on the Escute or Scheldt line, and last week we talked about 366 batteries escape to Dunkirk. And I know that our group is very overrepresented by 367 battery, for which I apologise, particularly to Martin, who's very much a 366 battery descendant. But we have talked about Graham Brooks and his group and how they escaped. And today we're going to talk about Cassel and the breakout from Cassel. So next slide, please. And this map just shows with blue stars where we've been. So we have the dial line, which was really basically the suburbs of Brussels, blue star, thank you, covering the dial line. And then you'll remember the French resistance through the Ardennes collapsed and the Germans advanced in a scythe-like manner and basically surrounded the BEF. And the other two stars, or the other three stars, are the Scheldt line, the French town of Saint-Gouin en Malantois, and then 366 batteries, defense of the Ypres Commune line, the Eastern Defence Corridor, which again is actually another slightly neglected campaign with full of heroism. So where we are now is the Panzer Army, the elite German troops are advancing. Well, they have actually already reached Boulogne, and they're threatening the escape of the British Expeditionary Force. And so, like often happened in 1940, an arbitrary line of defence is drawn up, and they've decided to use this canal called the La Bassée Canal as the arbitrary line to try and defend the Western corridor for the escape to Dunkirk. Next slide, please. And so, on the 23rd of May, where we left 140 Regiment was in Saint-Gouin and Malantois, and very sadly, the two batteries separated. 366 battery had suffered damage at the Escute campaign and only had 9 operational guns, and they'd had some deaths and injuries. So they weren't at full force, and they were assigned to defend the Eastern Corridor, whereas 367 battery, with headquarters staff, was sent to join General Noel Mason McFarlane, who was defending an area in the forest of Nieppe to protect the southern corridor, the southern approaches of this panzer force. But what actually happened, thank you, what actually happened was that the French defence in the southern pocket in Lille was actually better than we'd anticipated. And so MAC force, as it was called, wasn't really needed. And so 367's battery's relationship with the MAC force was actually quite temporary. It's only a day. And what a lot of this is all based on is Tom Christopherson's grandfather's war diary, which was written retrospectively in 1945. But it's full of information. It's got grid references, which are like gold because it tells us where the guns were positioned. And if we read this war diary entry for the 23rd of May, it describes what actually happened, but it's very terse and it's very unemotional. It simply says the HQ staff and 367 battery were ordered to join MAC force. It outlines why that was, because they had 11 operational guns. They marched through Lille. It's a journey of about 30 miles to the forest of Nieppe. They've tried to find a position to put their guns, but couldn't find anywhere particularly useful. It's flat there and quite wooded. So they weren't in action in this area. Next slide, please. And the following day, 24th of May, which would be the equivalent of Sunday of last weekend, just to get the perspective of the time, because the time races away at this point. 367 battery was ordered to join Nigel Somerset's group at Cassel, and he was defending what was called the Summer Force, which was to the north of the forest of Nieppe and was based at Cassel. And so here's the war diary for that day. So they then had to make a journey from Merville to Cassel up the main Dunkirk road, and that's a journey of about 50 miles. And 367 battery were one of the first batteries to actually arrive. So they found a scene of kind of desolation and carnage, because Cassel had been bombed, but it had been largely abandoned by the French army, although there was some weaponry and there were a few French soldiers there. And a large amount of the civilian population had fled. But what's very useful about this war diary is we have detailed military references of where the guns were positioned. And basically they positioned themselves around a mound to the right of Cassel, to the east of Cassel, called the Mont de Recollet. And so on arrival, they weren't actually in Cassel itself. They were on this mound, the Mont de Recollet, heavily wooded area, covering 360 degrees with 3 different gun positions. And by this time, they'd come under the command, thank you, Richard, and this is the road approaching, they'd come under the command of the 5th Royal Horse Artillery. And so this is a street view picture on the left of the approach into Cassel as you come up the main road towards Dunkirk. And on the left of the picture is Cassel itself. You can just see the sort of beginnings of the hill. And on the right of the picture is the Mont de Recollet. Mont de Recollet. And that building with a blue arrow pointing at it is called Chateau Masson. It's now a wedding venue, but it was chosen as HQ for both artillery regiments. So 367, Tom's grandfather would have been based there at HQ. And they had a troop, F troop in fact, which included Barry Ross's uncle, Arthur, was based covering that road with a gun on the left-hand side of the road and more guns, I think, in the grounds of the chateau. And so if you look at the satellite image, you can see that there's two mounds, they're hardly called mountains. They're about 350 feet in elevation. And there's a sort of saddle between them with a road passing between them. And that's quite significant in terms of the battle that then transpired. So initially, the regiment was on the Mont de Recollet to the right of Cassel itself. So next slide, please. I'm whistling through, we have to cover a lot of ground here. And here's a satellite image showing those map references very kindly provided by Tom's grandfather. So that's where we think the gun batteries were positioned. So HQ is the middle of the red arrows. There was a gun position to the right of the road going north to Dunkirk. And what's very important to understand is that roundabout that you can see, Richard, you might want to point at it with your mouse. That's it, that roundabout there did not exist in 1940, nor did that straight bit of road. So anyone travelling to Dunkirk would have to go up the hill, through Cassel and back down again. And so you can see the guns were strategically positioned to have a 360-degree coverage, and the Panzer army were coming to the left of the image, so Cassel is quite a steep sloped village, but to the western side, where Richard's arrow is pointing, it's much gentler. And so they're much more difficult to defend, in other words, because the Panzer tanks were able to ascend right up to the village because there wasn't much of an obstacle there. Now, points 4 and 5 are where the guns were moved to because the position at the Mont de Recollet became unsustainable as the battle progressed, and they had to abandon those positions, and everyone concentrated inside the village itself. So 4 and 5 were the later gun positions. And this is what they look like if you go and visit them, which of course is what we were supposed to all be doing. Well, not all of us, but a large number of us were planning to make this trip, and we're doing it virtually today because of coronavirus. But if we'd gone there today, this is what we would have been looking at. So we have on the right-hand image, we've got Chateau Masson, which is the HQ, now a wedding venue, with a rather grumpy janitor who wasn't very happy when we were sniffing around his grounds. But we spoke to him in broken French and made our peace. And then to the north of the Mont de Recollet, you can see one of the gun troops. I don't know which alphabetical number it was, but it was commanded by Odling, who was the commander of the regiment. And if you look right into the distance of that image where the guns are looking, there's a church spire there, just to the right, a little bit with your arrow, please, a little bit to the right, a little bit to the right. And that church spire is Vinizili Church. So you can see you've got an uninterrupted view quite a way to the east. And there was another gun troop positioned on the southeast, which is the image on the bottom right. And that's looking at a place called Mont de Cat, which is a monastery and another little bit of high ground where there was also a British defensive position and a large field ambulance based. And in the middle distance of that image, there's the small hamlet of Eeke, spelled E-E-K-E, which is where 140 Regiment had their supply depot. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. And so Cassel itself, if you go to the top of Cassel, you get this amazing view all over the Flanders Plain. You can easily see the English Channel, and you can see why strategically it's such an important position. And there is the 1940 map showing the main road up the hill and then down again, which is the Rue de Dunkirk, with the figure 58 next to it. Next slide, please. Now, Cassel was in a strange position because a lot of the natives, the Cassellois, as they call themselves, had left. But a large number of Belgian refugees had settled in the town. And so there was a kind of itinerant population. And the town was in a real mess because it had been quite heavily bombed, but had been basically not very vigorously defended by the French. And in amongst all the Belgian refugees who'd come to the town, almost certainly there was a large contingent of what's called fifth columnists. So see this lady here dressed as this gentleman dressed as a lady with a gun in her hand. That's a fifth columnist, and there was an awful lot of suspicion about fifth columnist activity in the town while the battle was raging. And this is what it looks like then and now. The troops who did go into Cassel, they went up that cobbled road on the eastern side of the town, and the first thing they encountered was a French artillery piece led by two horses, both of which had been killed. So the British soldiers named that corner Dead Horse Corner, which sort of kept that name to this day. That's very close to where the cemetery is, and where there was hand-to-hand fighting on the final day of the battle, as the Germans had actually climbed up to the top of the hill and were sniping through those hedges at the Oxford and Bucks light infantry who were defending that particular segment. There was a lot of the buildings in Cassel were commandeered. They all had cellars, fortunately, because most of the tops of the houses had been amputated by shell fire and mortar fire. And so Somerset's headquarters was in various buildings in the Grand Place of Cassel, depending on the shell fire situation and whether the building had collapsed on top of them. And there was a field ambulance building in the Grand Place, which is just there on the top left of the picture, which also received a direct hit from Stukas, and the shrapnel damage on that building is still evident to this day. Next slide, please. And then here's another satellite image, and this shows what David Heinsohn, I don't know if he's joined us yet, is interested in, and that is the Gloucesters. And they were defending the gentle slopes to the left of Cassel. So this is the B Company, D Company, C Company of the Gloucester Regiment. So in a way, they slightly had the shortest straw because they had to defend directly the panzers as they were approaching from the west. The Oxford and Bucks light infantry were defending to the right, the Dead Horse Corner side of the town. So they had a little bit more high ground, so they were in a slightly better position militarily. And then to the right of this image is the sketch from the East Yorkshire Yeomanry War Diary, which is very detailed, which shows the Mont de Recollet, and where 140 Regiment was positioned with its gun troops with my 3 blue stars. Just to the north of the Mont de Roquelatte, it says Tank Park. That's where the yeomanry park their tanks and Bren gun carriers. And that now has been converted into a beautiful Flemish garden. It's a lovely place, but it used to be a tank park for this regiment. Next slide, please. And so we haven't got time to talk about, there's an awful lot to talk about in Cassel. You can see why David Heinzen has got the bug for this. But in setting up the defences, Somerset had set up picket villages along the main railway line, which is now the Eurostar line. So if you ever go on a Eurostar and look to your left as you flash by, you will see all these places. So Zutpien and Bavinchove are both sort of small villages, and the Cassel station is actually at Bavinchove. And all of these were set up as picket villages on the lower ground to sort of act as a warning in case the tanks were advancing. And there's also a very famous picket point at a village of Hardefort, which is to the north of Cassel, where there's a bunker that still stands to this day, and it's now been converted into a museum. You have to get the key from the town hall, but this is the very famous and iconic bunker where Lieutenant Cresswell from the Gloucester Regiment maintained defence there well past the 30th of May, when Cassel itself had been evacuated. He was out of touch, didn't know what was happening. So now the reason we had time to set up defences in Cassel, and Somerset was able to get everything organised in the way he did, was because Hitler had ordered a halt order on the 24th of May. So for 2 days, the panzers did not move. And people debate the historical, we haven't got time to talk about why he did this. Maybe it was fear of overstretching his supply lines. Maybe it was because he was hoping against hope he could pull a deal with Halifax and Churchill and so on. But in any event, he made a big mistake, because that 2 days gave the British the chance to organise the Western defence, including Cassel. So that meant the Battle of Cassel really only got started on the 26th and 27th of May. So in other words, in our time, yesterday, 80 years on. And you can see on that blue arrow how vulnerable Cassel was, because it was well to the west of quite a lot of the other defensive points, and a little bit isolated as well. And the arrows on the left are showing the path the BEF was taking to retreat to Dunkirk, mainly a little bit to the left. The German position, this is a German map, it shows the main panzer armies, the 6th and 8th Panzer Army, which were both attempting to overrun Cassel, and in the end they never did. They just went round the side of it. Cassel was never overrun, but they did achieve an overrun at Ypres, and therefore all the ammunition and supplies and so on were taken. Next slide. And so the German armour in 1940, you're all very familiar with. They were well equipped, well trained, they battle hardened because of the Polish experience. These mortars that are firing on the right of the picture were very troublesome, very well aimed, and possibly assisted by 5th columnists. The Stuka was used as an advanced artillery weapon. The BEF didn't really have proper air support, and the German equipment generally was regarded as superior. And the next slide. And the Germans had secret weapons as well. We've talked about 5th columnists who were directing sniper fire, they were directing shell fire, they were in radio communication with their air force. And they were all high on amphetamines, it now appears. And so they didn't need to sleep for those few days of battle, because they were taking what is now crystal meth, methamphetamine. Next slide, please. Whereas opposing them were the British forces, some of which were actually quite effective. And the most effective weapon was the 2-pounder anti-tank gun, which is on the top left of this picture, which Major Cartland operated and he was based at Cassel, a couple of troops of the Worcester Yeomanry, and those were incredibly effective anti-tank weapons. The 18-pounder gun, which 140 Regiment were using, was the green weapon on the bottom left picture, which isn't designed to be used as an anti-tank weapon at all. It's a field gun, but was used on open sites firing directly at tanks, and was still actually achieved quite a lot of direct hits. We had an anti-tank rifle called the Boys rifle, which wasn't very effective unless aimed very carefully. We had the Bren carrier, which you can see very exposed. We had very little air support, and the Matilda tank, there was only there in small numbers. So we weren't really in a good position to fight off the Germans with that equipment. And the other major problem we had is a dysfunctional relationship with both our allies, the Belgians and the French. The French distrusted us and vice versa, and the Belgian forces surrendered on the 28th of May, making our northeastern flank very vulnerable. And historians often talk about the famous meeting that took place in Cassel on the 27th of May. So Cassel by this stage was under sustained shell fire and air attack, and yet the top brass military just convened a meeting at this place, the Hotel du Savage in Cassel itself, in the Grand Place. And it was a bit like the lockdown. It was a kind of, the British were trying to say, you can go out, but you can't go out. And it was very much a sort of contradiction. And what they were trying to say is, we're not actually evacuating. We're going to stay and fight, but at the same time, we are in fact evacuating. And so there was the meeting broke up with no decisions made, and in fact, both parties had to leave the town very quickly because the building was under sustained attack. And they were actually both French and British were very lucky to have escaped from Cassel without being captured. So now let's talk about yesterday, the 27th of May, when this battle really kicked off.
John, you've got 7 minutes.
Oh, okay, we're going to run out of time, but don't worry, we can pull it back. Okay, next, please. So the main battle starts on the 27th of May, and here is Neville Christopherson's war diary. He sets off on that morning to go to the supply depot at Ypres and doesn't get more than 200 yards when he realizes that the Mont de Récollet is under sustained tank attack. And this is where he has to set up F Troop. And next slide, please. And the battle takes place at Chateau Masson. As tanks are approaching into this picture, there's a gun firing back at them. And F Troop, which we now know included Ronald Baxter, who's in our group, Lieutenant May, and Arthur Ross, obviously, who's in our group, and Sergeant Swindle, who was unfortunately killed during this battle, who we've already heard about. He was injured at the Escoute. Next slide, please. And the day didn't go well. It was obviously a very difficult day. They've sustained attacks all the way from panzers and mortars, and at 9 o'clock in the evening, the regiment had to withdraw from the Mont de Récollet into the town itself. Next slide, please. The next day, which is today, 80 years ago, the whole purpose of the Cassel defence was becoming obvious now, because the Operation Dynamo was underway. It was day 2 of Operation Dynamo, although at this stage only just less than 20,000 troops had been evacuated, so nowhere near enough. And what happened is there was sustained shelling and mortaring of Cassel, so much so that petrol stoves were being put out by the concussion of shells. It was impossible to cook anything. They had to use wooden stoves. And in the northern troop, that became under sustained attack. And Odling, the commander, was wounded. He had a leg injury. And so therefore, Neville Christopherson had to take over command of the regiment. And here's a picture of Odling on the left. It's in a POW camp in Offlag 9, sitting next to Brigadier Somerset on his right. And there's the gun position where he got his injury. Next slide, please. The next day, the 29th of May, was the final day of the battle. And by this stage, nearly 60,000 troops had been evacuated, and the little ships were beginning to assemble, and some of them had started coming across the channel. And it was another day of furious battle, with some hand-to-hand combat taking place in with the Gloucester Regiment on the gentle slopes, and also at the top of the town. And this was the day, the famous day, when the delayed message arrived to Brigadier Somerset that the Cassel garrison should now be relieved and should try and make its own way back to Dunkirk. Unfortunately, that message was held up. On that day, you can see the panzers had now surrounded Cassel. They decided not to try and capture it. They'd simply advance onwards towards the escaping British troops. So Cassel was completely surrounded. And these green flags are showing the position where we think the gun troops of 140 Regiment were, judging by the debris they left behind. And there you can see there's a green flag, the one in the middle. That's where Tom's grandfather received his injury. Next slide, please. So, as I say, another desperate day of sustained air attack, but it all died down by about 5 o'clock that day. The Germans, I think, having given up trying to seize the town itself and just were simply advancing onwards. Next slide, please. Aware of the time. And so the situation on the 29th of May is that Cassel was now surrounded, and the troops were all simply in the town itself. The picket villages had all been lost, although some of the survivors of those battles had made their way back successfully. And the only picket village holding out was the bunker at Le Perquel, where Lieutenant Cresswell was still firing his Bren guns and so on. The Germans did attempt to try and make the Allies surrender by dropping leaflets. You can see the Germans were very impressed by this defense. They called Cassel a nest of furious resistance. And General von Bloch wrote, "This struggle is hard. The British are as tough as leather, and my divisions are exhausted." So it was obviously a very heroic defense. And so here's the final entry in Neville Christopherson's war diary, and it describes his own injury. He was asked at 10:30 in the morning to fire a field gun towards some mortars that were shelling headquarters in Grand Place Cassel. He said to the brigadier, "I'm not sure this is going to particularly help, and it's just going to incite more firing." And that's, sure enough, that's what happened. Mortars got the range of the gun and destroyed it. Neville Christopherson himself got a severe head injury, got a skull fracture, was knocked unconscious, and 2 of his gunners were killed. Next slide, please. And this is where it took place. And there, you remember that archway we showed you? This is the other side of it, and that's where Neville Christopherson's gun was. And that's what it looks like today. And incredibly, it looks very similar today as it did in 1940, which is the image on the right, the same cobbled road, the main road into Dunkirk. And that little 10 figure there is the symbol of the BEF. And the next slide, please. There's Harry Woolston, who was one of his gunners, who was killed, and he's buried in the cemetery at Cassel. It's a small cemetery. But next slide, please. And then you have the aftermath pictures. I think this is our final slide, so we're in time, which shows one of Major Cartland's 2-pounder artillery pieces. And this is a very iconic image of 2 rather baffled Germans trying to work out how they had so much resistance. And the tank that particular gun had hit is there. It's actually a Czechoslovakian tank.